Chapter 3, Recalling Old Skills, page 31. That day the women went back in time to recall the skills and knowledge that they had been taught from early childhood. They began by making snowshoes. Usually, birchwood was collected during the late spring and early summer, but today the young birch would have to do. They didn't have the correct tools, of course, but the women managed with what they had to split the woods into 4 parts each, and they boiled their large birch in their large birch containers. And when the wood became soft, the women bent it and roundish made it in points and tips, putting 2 of these rounded halves and sides together. And the women awkwardly drilled many little holes into the sides with their small pointed sewing awls, and the work was very hard, but despite their anky figures, the women continued until they finished their task. Earlier they had soaked the babachi in water, and now that it was softened material, they sliced it into thin strips, wove it into snowshoes, and the babachi hardened with little help from the campfire. The women prepared leather bindings for their snowshoes. When they finished, the women beamed with pride. Then they walked around the snow with their slightly awkward but serviceable snowshoes to check the rabbit snares that were further cheered to find they had caught another rabbit, and knowledge that for a few days before the people had tried to snare rabbits in the area without success, made the women feel almost superstitious about their good luck, and when they went back to camp feeling lighthearted about all they had accomplished. That night the women talked about their plans. They agreed that they could not remain in the fall camp where they had been abandoned, for there was not enough animals on which to survive the long winter. They also were afraid of the potential enemies that might come upon them. Other bands were traveling too. Even in the cold winter, the women did not want to be exposed to such dangers. They also began to fear their own people because of the broken trust. The 2 women decided that they must move on, fearing the cold weather would force people to do desperate things to survive, remembering the taboo stories handed down generations about how some had turned into cannibals to survive. The 2 old women sat in the shelter thinking about where to go. Suddenly Chagdasaw burst out, "I know of a place." "Where?" said Sa in an excited voice. "Do you remember the place where we fished long ago, the creek where the fish were so abundant that we had to build so many catches to dry them?" The younger women searched their memory for a moment, and then in the vague place came to mind, "Yeah, I do. But why did we ever not return?" said Chagdasaw. She didn't know either. "Maybe the people forgot the place existed," she ventured. Whatever the reason, the 2 old women agreed that it would be a good place to go now, and since it was a long distance, they should leave at once, and the 2 yearned to be far away from as possible from this place with the bad memories. The following morning they packed. Their caribou skins served the purpose. That day they served as pulling sleds. Taking the 2 skins off the tent frame, the women laid the skins flat on the first surface facing the snow, and then they packed their possessions neatly on the skins and laced them tightly shut with long strips of babachi. They fastened the long wooden ropes to the moose leather skins to the front of the skins of the sled, and each woman tied a rope around her waist. With the fur of the caribou hide sliding against the snow, deep snow, and the women's snowshoes were making walking easier, the 2 women began their long journey. Temperatures had dropped, and the cold air made the women's eyes sting. Time and time again they had to warm their faces with their bare hands and continue to wipe the tears from their irritated eyes. But the fur skins and clothing served well, and for the cold it was their warm bodies remained warm. The women walked late into the night. They had not gone too far, but both were bone-weary and felt as though they had been walking forever. Deciding to camp, the women dug deep pits in the snow and filled them with spruce boughs. Then they built a small campfire, reboiling the squirrel meat and drinking its broth. They were so tired they soon fell asleep. This time they did not moan or twitch, but slept deep and soundlessly. Morning arrived, and the two women woke in deep, cold surroundings them when the sky above seemed like a bowl of stars. But as the women tried to climb out of their pits, their bodies would not move. Looking at each other's eyes, the women realized they had pushed their bodies beyond physical endurance. Finally, the younger, more determined Saa managed to move, but the pain was so great that she let out an agonized groan. Knowing that this would happen too, Chagdasa lay there for a while, gathering courage to withstand the pain she knew would come. Finally, she too made her way slowly and painfully out of the snow shelter, and the women limped around the camp to loosen their stiff joints. After they chewed on the remaining squirrel meat, they continued their journey, pulling their laden toboggans. That day would be remembered as one of the longest and hardest of the days to come. They stumbled numbly on, many times falling down into the snow from their sheer fatigue and old age. Yet they pushed on, almost in desperation, knowing that each step brought them nearer to their destination. The distant sunlight had appeared for a short while each day, peeped hazily out through the icy fog that hung in the air. Now and again, blue skies could be seen, but mostly the women noticed on their own frosty breath coming in thick swirls. Freezing their lungs was another worry, and they took care not to work too hard in the cold, and if such work was unavoidable, they wore protective coverings over their faces. This could cause irritating side effects, such as frost buildup, where the covering brushed against their faces. However, the women did not notice such minor discomforts compared with their aching limbs, stiff joints, and swollen feet. Sometimes even the heavy sled seemed to serve its purpose by keeping the women from falling flat on their faces while they pulled onward with the ropes wrapped around their chests. As the few hours of daylight slipped away, the women's eyes readjusted to the dark and began to unfold them. But they knew that night had not yet arrived and there was still time to move. When it became time to camp, the women found themselves on a large lake. They could see the outline of the trees and the shore, and they knew from the forest it would be a better place to camp. But they were so exhausted that they could go no farther, and again they dug a deep pit in the snow, and after snuggling down and covering themselves with their skin blankets, they were soon asleep, and the thick and fur clothing held their body heat and protected them from the cold air. The snow pit was warm as any shelter above ground, so the women slept mindless of the freezing temperatures that made even the most ferocious northern animals seek shelter. The next morning, Saa woke first. The long sleep, the cold air cleared their minds considerably. With a twisting grimace, she struck her head out of the hole to look around, and she saw the outline of trees on the shore and remembered how they had been too tired to complete their crossing of the lake. She got up slowly, not wanting to disturb her friend's slumber, and knowing that with a wrong move her stiffened body would lock up and refuse to go. A smile hovered around her lips as she thought of how her friend had complained loudly and often of their minor aches and pains a few days before, and how of the walking sticks that they had used until forgotten back at the camp the day before. Slowly stretching in the chilly night air, she had made a mental note to remind her friend of this when the right time came. They could laugh over the fact that for years they had carried those sticks around to help them better walk now, and somehow they had managed to walk miles without those walking sticks. Putting on their snowshoes, Saa walked about to loosen her stiffness in her joints. From within the pit, Chagdasa looked up at an agile companion who slowly circled the shelter. Chagdasa was feeling tired and miserable. She knew she must do her best to stand beside her friend, though this hardship. She had thought long enough to know that if she gave up, her friend would give up too. So she forced herself to move, but the pain that filled her body made her lie back and down and let out a deep sigh. Saw that Chigdasa was having a hard time, so she reached down to help her climb out of the pit, and together, grunting, struggling to move. Soon the two were walking and kept right on going until they reached the edge of the lake. They built a fire, and after eating some of the rabbit meat they had carefully rationed, they returned to their sleds and resumed their journey. The frozen lake seemed endless. Struggling through many spruce trees, willow thickets, and thorn patches that lay between the lakes wore the women out. They felt as if they had traveled many more miles than they had. Despite having to make many detours and obstacles, the women never completely lost their sense of direction. Sometimes fatigue clouded their judgment, and they found themselves straying slightly off course or going in circles, but soon they found their way again, and in vain they hoped that the sloth that they had would suddenly appear. Indeed, there were many times when one of them would fantasize that they had reached their destination, but the constant reminders of the intense cold and the aching bones brought them back quickly to reality. On the fourth night, the women almost stumbled into the sloth. Everything around them stood shrouded against the silvery moonlight. Shadows stretched beneath the many trees and over the sloth. The women stood on the banks for a few moments, resting their eyes and looking at the beauty of this special night. Sa marveled at the power the land had over the people like herself, over the animals, even over the trees, and they all depended on the land. If the rules were not obeyed quickly and unjudgmentally, death would fall upon the careless and unworthy. Chagdasa looked at her friend Sa and sighed deeply. "What's the matter?" she said. Sa's face creased with a smile. "Nothing is wrong, my friend. We are on the right trail after all. I was thinking about how it used to be that the land was so easy for me to live on, and now it seems it does not want me. Perhaps it's just my aching joints that are making me complain." Chagdasa laughed. "Perhaps it is because our bodies are just too old, or maybe we are out of shape. Maybe the time will come when we will spring across this land again." Sa joined in the joke. Such musings were meant only to lift their spirits, and the women knew that their journey was not over, nor would their struggle for survival become easier. Although they had grown soft in their old age, Chagdasa and Sa knew that they would pay a high price for the toll before their land yielded them any comforts. The two women walked down the winding sloth until they came upon the large river. Even in times of cold weather, the swishing undercurrents in the river eroded the ice and made it thin and dangerous to walk on. The women realized this as they carefully inched their way across the river, kept their senses alert for the sound of cracking ice or any hint of the stream rising from between the ice chinks. Finally, they reached the other side, and the tension and fatigue left their bodies. The women, mentally and physically drained, with what little energy remained, they numbly set on the task of building yet another overnight shelter. Page 44.